It's time for more custom legendary dragons.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
That's right, we've got 10 more cards here, part 2 of our custom legendary dragons. So let's go ahead and jump into these amazing cards. Up first here is the Time Lost. Reference, I'm presuming, to the Time Lost Proto Drake from World of Warcraft. It's an 8 mana 6/8 dragon from Flatwoods. It's for Hunter, and the battle cry reads, for each dragon on the battlefield, adapt. And that makes sense because you got a Proto Drake who is adapting and evolving into the dragons we know and love in the World of Warcraft and Hearthstone today. And from a mechanic standpoint, love the usage of the adapt keyword here. I feel like that's something that was pretty cool to see in Unguro. I'd love to see it brought back. I thought it was a lot of fun. And the idea here of kind of a survival of the fittest, right? Like to compete with the other dragons on board, the Time Lost has to adapt to keep up with the other things that the other dragons are doing. So, if a couple dragons on board here, you get yourself a neat little minion, right? It's not quite perhaps to the Galvadon levels where you get like 5 adapts, but you might be able to get like Stealth and Wind Fury for something really aggressive. You might be able to get like Taunt and +3 health for something powerful. If you get up to like 4 or 5 adapts, you do get to that Galvadon level, which is pretty crazy, but a hard board scenario to set up, right? Unless the meta is just totally dominated by dragons, it's going to be tough because you're not going to have 5 dragons on board. Maybe your opponent has 1 or 2 dragons. You may not be able to play any. Maybe you've got like 1 leftover dragon. So getting to that like 3 or 4 adapt mark is going to be really tough, I think, in most scenarios, but still, even at 1 or 2, that's pretty sweet. Now, this is a fairly expensive minion at 8 mana. It feels a bit like the Volcanosaur of old, right? Because it could be much worse, but could be much better. So you got to get that upside there. It's going to have to be in a specific kind of meta. You could even consider this a tech card of sorts. Like maybe you don't really run any dragons, but if there's a meta that's dominated by dragons, your opponent has 4 or 5 dragons out there. Maybe you got some leftovers from Leroy Jenkins. I don't know. But this could do that as an answer to dragon metas, even if you're not running a dragon hunter deck yourself. You build something big and awesome. So a cool couple different directions to take a card like this from a playability standpoint. To be frank, I'd probably bump up the power level on this one a little, maybe make it cheaper, make the stats more, whatever it might be. I think it could use just a slight tweak upwards, but I love the idea of it. I love the mechanics being explored, and I love the reference to the character, or at least the Time Lost Proto Drake here, the mount. And all of that makes for a pretty sweet card. Up next here is Tyragosa from Unmitigated Disaster, a 6 mana 3/6 dragon for Priest. And although I know there is some precedent in the past for Hearthstone that human form dragons, see Wrathion, are not actually getting the dragon tribe, I certainly think it's okay here to depict it in human form and still give it the tribe. That's not a big deal to me. And the battle cry on this card reads, add a copy of the last 3 cards played to your hand. So we already saw a card fairly similar to this in our previous Dragon Legendary Card Review Part 1, but this one takes it in a slightly different direction, putting it on a battle cry, not giving you any sort of discount, but just giving you a targeted time to play a card like this so that you can get exactly the sort of things you need. And this can be used on your end. You can play 3 things like a couple power word shields and you get some power word shields back, right? Maybe it feels a bit like a Kragwa for Shaman in that world where you just get an instant payback instead of on the next turn. That could be really nice. Alternatively, you could use this to get copies of your opponent's cards. If they play 3 awesome things that you really want, you can add those to your hand. You're taking a tempo loss to do that in most cases, right? Because it's the 6 mana 3/6, pretty terrible body here, but you're generating some awesome resources and resources on demand. But knowing that that exists, your opponent can make some decisions as well. Like maybe they play an awesome card and then 2 fairly weak cards, A rogue drops a couple deadly poisons afterwards to prevent you from getting a lot of value out of your Tyragosa, right? There are certain ways for both players to interact with this effect in a pretty neat way, which I like those sorts of cards. I think I talk about all the time. So a cool idea here that matches up with Priest's goals and what Priest likes to do very nicely. A cool card from a strategy standpoint for both players. Fine fit for a dragon as far as I'm concerned. So all in all, some pretty cool stuff happening with this one. Up next here is Lord Etharius from Void Volume, a druid dragon. Green dragon's nice choice there. 9 mana 8/8, and the battle cry reads, increase all numbers in both players' decks by 1. And this is just such a cool idea. I don't even really know where to start on how to analyze the effect or impact of an idea like this, but it's just so cool, right? Druids are the mana manipulation class. They're always doing weird stuff with mana. So Lord Etharius addresses that pretty quickly, right? Because mana costs all go up by 1. And that makes like 0 mana spells a much weaker, that's like an infinite increase to their cost. They can't do nearly as many shenanigans, right? Makes 10 mana cards virtually unplayable outside of additional discounts coming later, which is pretty crazy. So if your opponent's reliant on 10 mana stuff, Lord Etherea is like the perfect tech card to that. So a couple really cool implications. And of course, every card gets a little bit weaker along the way. Maybe a 7 mana card going to 8 isn't nearly as impactful as a 0 going to 1 or a 1 going to 2. So decks that rely on really big stuff, maybe it's not quite as negative, whereas I think if decks are trying to chain together many small cards in a single turn, these mana increases stack up much faster the more cards you play per turn, right? So better against certain kinds of things. Now, beyond that, it's not just mana, right? It's also attack values, it's like battle cries, it's health, of course. Any kind of thing, drawing cards, instead of drawing 3 cards, you draw 4 cards now, right? So there are just a chain of implications here. This might completely break something. I can't think of every possible iteration that this could break, but certainly if you're playing this in your deck, you can construct your deck in a way that utilizes this really well, right? Maybe you do have those card draw cards. Maybe you have things that duplicate stats, and even just like Oasis Surgers, right? They get much bigger, a little bit more expensive, but every time you duplicate this increase, you get more and more stats, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. I just know this is a really cool idea, a very fun mechanic, a big, awesome mechanic that completely changes how you build your deck, how you think about games. That is awesome to me. I'd love to see this sort of thing in Hearthstone, assuming it's not broken. I think importantly, Void Volume put this late in the game at a high cost, pretty low tempo play in the scheme of things. So if you do want to do this, there is a lot of cost associated with it, so it's not something that's going to break the game early. It's a late game sort of thing, so very smart to do that. If this was a 1 mana 1/1, I'd be like, nope, shut that down right now because I don't know what that's going to do. But when you put it there, it's a little bit safer of a design. So important recognition there, but just a very cool mechanic. I want to see this in the game. I want to figure out how this works. I want to play this. It's scary, yes. Maybe it's broken. Tell me in the comments if you found some way to break this. I'm sure there is some way out there to break this. But nonetheless, I don't care. I love it a ton. Moving on to a card from Little Sunflora. This is Almas ATAR, a 6 mana 5/7 for Mage. The battle cry reads, turn all spells in your hand into random dragons. They cost the same as the spells they replace. So if you have 5 spells in hand, you play Almas ATAR, you're going to get 5 dragons in your hand in those spells' places. And I think there's a little bit of a debate here, possible, about the interpretation of this second line of text. I could read this 2 ways. One is that the spells being replaced are guaranteed to be a dragon of the same cost. So for instance, if you have a Flame Strike, it will turn into a Crowd Roaster, because that's a 7 mana dragon for a 7 mana spell. Alternatively, you could interpret this as it's going to be any random dragon, and that dragon will take the cost of the spell. So for instance, if you have an Elemental Evocation in hand and it turns into an Onyxia, that will be a 0 mana Onyxia. But for the sake of balance, I'm going to assume the former instead of the latter, because otherwise you could get a giant hand full of extremely low cost 0/1 mana spells and turn them all into like Ysera's and Alexstrasza's and Onyxias, and you could play like 0 mana Onyxias and 1 mana Ysera's and 2 mana Alexstrasza's, and I think that would be completely broken. So I'm going to assume instead that this means a Flame Strike will turn into a Crowd Roaster and a Frostbolt will turn into a Fairy Dragon because it is a 2 mana spell, because I think that's really the only way to maintain the balance here. But I still really like this idea, because what can happen with mages, you can often generate a ton of spells in hand. Some of them are awkward, some of them don't really do what you need them to do. This gives you a way to leverage those and turn them into minions. So for instance, if you have a bunch of removal spells in a control versus control matchup, you don't need Flame Strikes against a deck that's not playing threats. This allows you to turn your Flame Strikes into threats. It allows you to turn your big spells into scary, crazy stuff, right? If you have like Puzzle Box of Yogg-Saron, you can turn it into an Imris, and then play that Imris and double all the other dragons in your hand stats, right? And you've got these cool sorts of chains that start happening, particularly with dragon synergies. We have things in hand activating your cards. That's really cool. So you turn all your spells into dragons, and you've got a bundle of dragon synergy cards as well, particularly in wild format where that's a little bit more common these days. So I'm going to take the safer route there, the conservative route, even if that's not what Little Sunflora intended for this design. I think it's too powerful otherwise. I'm curious what you guys think, which way you read it and which way you'd like it to be. But I think this is a cool card in that idea, turning junk, garbage, leftover spells that have accumulated into something that can perhaps be better. Now, on average, right, I mean, a Fairy Dragon's not very useful. You might prefer the Frostbolt, but you can make that decision. You can build your hand, build your deck in a way to support that. So I think this card gives you some awesome alternate angles to take a game, and that's a pretty neat design. All right, so moving on here to Meloria from My Name Is For Real. This is a 6 mana 6/6 neutral dragon, and the battle cry reads, discover a dragon and a legendary minion, and then you fuse those together into a 3/3 aberration that costs 3 mana. So we've got here kind of a Zombeast style effect like old Deathstalker Rexar hero power, but instead of being 2 random beasts, you're getting specifically a dragon and a legendary minion. And this is a super cool idea for Meloria and all sorts of Nefarian type scientific pursuits. Fusing dragons, doing crazy stuff with dragons is what these characters were all about. So I love this from a flavor and fantasy standpoint. Now, I will admit that when you take cards with really long text lines and you fuse them with cards with really long text lines, what's going to happen is you're going to get a card that is almost impossible to display all the text. So there are perhaps some UI challenges in a card like this that might make it rather difficult to put into Hearthstone, and I don't know that the dev team would even ever consider a card like this. There might be some fixes for that, though, where you just say, like, this card's a combination of Malygos and Electrostorm Surge, and you hover over it, and it kind of shows both of those effects so that you can start to get a picture of it. So I do think there's some solutions to that problem that would be possible. I don't know if they'd be undertaken, but they're possible. But it's just such a cool idea that I'm willing to overlook those challenges regardless. And think about all the cool combinations you can make, right? Like, I made the coolest combination I could think of here, which is Malygos plus Electrostorm Surge. Now, obviously, the odds of getting exactly these 2 cards is incredibly slim, but if you ever did, this would be absolutely nuts, right? So you'd be playing a 3 mana 3/3 that gives you +5 spell damage and also doubles your next spell. So you slam a Lava Burst, right? That's like 20 damage on its own right there, because it's going up to 10 total damage from the Malygos, and then Electra's making it cast twice. That's 20 damage for 3 mana, which is just obscene. But there are all kinds of crazy combinations you can get here, right? Because the dragon pool is pretty diverse, all kinds of nutty stuff. And then legendary minions, of course, who knows what you're going to get. But it's a cool idea that you've got to choose a dragon first. It's a good base, and stats don't really matter, right? So it's all about onboard effects, because they're always turning into 3 mana 3/3s, which is good, by the way, because otherwise the stats could snowball like crazy, and mana costs wouldn't add up effectively either. There are some limitations on Rexar to help prevent those sorts of things. So Meloria here counts for all those issues already, but a very cool idea. Share your craziest combination in the comments below. I want to hear what you've made that's even better than Malygos plus Electra. That was the coolest thing that came to mind for me, but there are some pretty nasty ones, I bet, for cool things you could do with your aberration card here. So My Name Is For Real just got the gears spinning, and I like cards like that. So now let's move on to Runeic, the Mana Drake from Dloffer Ferg. It's a 3 mana 4/2 dragon for Mage. Death Rattle reads go dormant, and then to awaken it, you cast a spell that costs 5 or more mana. And this Death Rattle Go Dormant thing is apparently trending in the custom cards community, because we've already talked about one of these in part 1, I think. We got another one coming up in this video. They're all kind of based on Shares in the Corpse Flower, a card from long, long ago, but just putting different effects and different classes on them, which is great. That's Hearthstone-esque, right? Hearthstone does those same sorts of things. And I think this is interesting for a couple reasons. One, not many people submitted low mana cost dragons here. Most legendary dragons were huge, so some bonus points for going a little bit of a different direction than most folks there. Beyond that, I really like this card because a 3 mana 4/2, right, is a fairly weak minion, and certainly getting it back 3 or 4 times for 3 mana is great, which will happen because it's not hard to cast 5 mana spells. This is easier to activate than Sharazin ever was. It will come back more often in a class like Mage that has a lot of big 5 mana spells. But the thing to keep in mind is with a card like Sharazin, it was a card that was in a tempo deck. You wanted it to revive quickly. You cared about the pressure that it presented, and playing cards really quickly synergized. It meshed well with that style of deck. Tempo decks like playing things out quickly. Runeic, on the other hand, shifts things a little differently because in a deck that's running a lot of 5-cost spells, a 4/2 minion isn't going to go nearly as far. If you're running Flame Strikes and Blizzards, your deck's probably looking to be a little bit grindier, more late game, more control-oriented, and the 4/2 will just kind of be a little baby complementary piece as opposed to an important part of your strategy, which I actually like because it's so much easier, but that's okay because the deck probably doesn't care about it as much. So it introduces a nice little level of balance again, which is pretty sweet. Plus, from a flavor standpoint, just like spending mana to bring this thing back to life feels really cool. So a great way to activate this minion. And I think it would be great. Just an early game minion for mage that they can keep pulling back and get a little bit of a bonus, trade into the board a little bit better, disrupt what your opponent's trying to do. That fits really well. It's a super cool, simple idea. Harkens back to a great card, and all in all, hits a lot of great points, checks a lot of boxes, so pretty sweet design. So now let's move on to Sinestro from Sedathar. This is a 6-mana 4/4 neutral dragon. The battle cry reads, add 3 eggs to your hand, which you'll see over there. And each turn those are in your hand, they transform into another random dragon. So we've got here cards a bit like, say, Chameleos or Shifter Xeris, where they are transforming into something every turn. And even though, or even Libidinous Floop as well, kind of. So when they transform, they're not permanently transforming. They keep transforming every turn again and again, which is a cool idea, right? So you're adding 3 dragon resources to your hand for Sinestro at a little bit of a tempo loss because 6-mana 4/4 is fairly weak body. But you're getting the luxury of making decisions about those dragons for when they line up well. So instead of like getting a random fairy dragon and being stuck with a fairy dragon, yeah, maybe you wait a turn, maybe it turns into a Ysera. And you're way happier about that because you get a great minion instead of a weak one, but then like maybe I don't have enough mana to play Ysera right now, or I need to do something else more reactive, so I gotta wait, and then Ysera turns into something bad again, right? So there's always these cool decisions that happen with these sorts of cards, and since there's 3 of them, that's way better to me than just having 1 of them. That's what always kept cards like Shifter Xeris and Chameleos in a tough spot, I think, is that you don't really have a lot of luxury of choice, but when you have 3 of them, suddenly it's like, okay, I have a Ysera every turn, essentially, right? Or some high cost minion. You're way more likely to hit something good on any given scenario because there are 3 total to choose from. So you have a lot more luxury to pick things at the right time, which is really, really cool. And of course, all of this fits Sinestro very well as a character, I should note as well. So great design there from a fantasy standpoint. But a cool idea, and it can't turn into Sinestro, is clarified here as well, which is nice. Otherwise, you kind of infinitely chain resources, which might be a problem. But a neat idea here for a card. Keeps your opponent on their toes, keeps you on your toes, adds a lot of decision points to the game, a lot of strategy. All of that's great for me. So flavorful, fun, skill challenging. That's an awesome card. Now let's take a look at Endor from Spark&Area. It's the 6-mana 5/4 dragon for Paladin with a battle cry that reads, gain a random keyword for each dragon in your hand. So a little bit similar to our first card, the Time Lost, shifting things to a hand synergy, which certainly makes sense mechanically for dragons. That reflects what most dragon synergy cards are about. Thematically, a little different. The Time Lost made sense thematically. This one makes sense mechanically, which is great. But instead of adapt here, we've got keywords, which debatably better in some ways, worse in others, but a cool idea that's going to give you a really good minion often when you play this. Now, as far as keywords are concerned, I don't know if we're considering things from every expansion. Like, does magnetic make sense with a card like this, right? Probably not. So I think what would happen if a card like this existed in the game, it would be a predefined set of keywords that make sense. So like Rush and Taunt and Lifesteal and Charge and Wind Fury, and there may be more that I'm not listing here, but I think Blizzard would go in and code it and program it to only do things that make sense. Because like Death Rattle, for instance, well, that doesn't make sense because there's no like follow-up to the Death Rattle. You don't know what the Death Rattle would do. So I'm not worried about the execution of a card like this. That can all be solved in the game client, no big deal there. But what that means is you've got a card that's often going to come down that's got, you know, at least 3 or 4 awesome keywords, so that Zilliax style sort of thing. It could get Divine Shield and Rush and Wind Fury and take crazy trades. It could get Charge and Wind Fury and do a ton of damage. But the check here is you have to have dragons in hand. So 1, only going to work in dragon decks or dragon support decks. 2, you've probably sacrificed a lot of tempo and onboard presence in this sort of deck because you've been keeping resources in your hands in order to make your Endor move good. So there are a couple ways to self-balance this card. Now, I love this because Paladin has gotten some sort of hand dragon support. We got like Bronze Herald and Rise of Shadows adding some dragons to your hand. Endormu would love that sort of thing. It would be a great follow-up card for that kind of deck and could help make Dragon Paladin a real thing because you got Nozari, you got Bronze Herald, you got the Dragon Speaker, I think it's called, the hand buff card. So a cool little package should come together here, and Andormu could be the payoff for that package. You're not always going to get Charge Wind Fury, you're not always going to get Divine Shield Rush, but if you have enough dragons in hand, you might get a great combination of things that make this a powerful swing card or just a lethal finisher sort of card. So pretty sweet design here. Maybe a little overpowered if I'm being honest. Like, I could envision bringing the stats down, maybe just making this 7 mana because of those like Charge, Wind Fury scenarios. It's a little scary. I'm sure Blizzard would tweak the numbers here. You guys might as well. But all aside, I love the mechanics here. I love the idea of this one. So pretty sweet card. And then finally here for our last card, we have another version of Nithog. We had one in our part 1. This one comes from Faroon. This is a 6 mana 4/8 dragon with Overload and Taunt, and it reads, whenever this minion takes damage, add a Broodling to your hand. The Broodling's a 3 mana 2/4, also a dragon, and also Overload 1, and it deals 1 damage to all enemy minions. So the idea here is you got yourself a nice defensively minded minion. A 4/8 for 6 is a very powerful taunt. If your opponent doesn't efficiently answer it, if they have to take 2 or 3 hits to kill it, you get these Broodlings, which can presumably wreak a little bit of havoc on their board. Also have some Battlecry synergies, which is nice certainly for Shaman these days, but much worse probably at default than a card like Sandstorm Elemental, because these cost a little bit more. You have to work to earn them, right? But nonetheless, I can envision a lot of slower control style decks loving a card like this one. Just having that big body get in the way is awesome. Having additional resources generated is awesome, and having extra AoE options is awesome. So Nithog checks a lot of boxes for slower Shaman decks. Also thematically feels very good for the character, very lightning oriented. He has a lot of Broodlings hanging around all the time. If you played Legion, you'll in World of Warcraft, you'll recognize this character and recognize how many Broodlings you had to deal with. So all of that lines up very well. It makes sense a ton. I think that you could argue this card doesn't necessarily need Taunt, and then it would feel a little less strong to me, because right now it does feel pretty good. But frankly, I'm okay with that too. It forces the action. It makes your opponent have to think about how to handle it very well and have efficient answers to it. So I would probably tweak a number or 2 on this card for balance, or maybe remove a keyword here or there. But that's okay. Still a lot of awesome stuff happening here, and pretty cool representation of the character. Good fit for the class. So sweet card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for our legendary dragons. That was 20 awesome cards. Frankly, I almost could have got to 30 cards and done a part 3 on this one. There were a lot of really, really cool designs this time around. Some good cards had to be left out, frankly. But that's how it goes. There's only so many spots. I don't think I can stretch to a part 3 in any given video. I think you guys would yell at me for trying to milk views or whatever. If you disagree with that, let me know. I mean, maybe there will be a future video where a part 3 kind of makes some sense. Who knows? Depends on how many good cards there are. That said, you may already know the submission for next time around is Legendary Weapons. I'll put the link in the description of this video again so that you can find that, submit some cards. Already some cool designs coming in for that one as well. But until then, please share your thoughts on these designs, what you liked, what you hated. I'm always curious to hear your opinions. And until next time, game on.